Imagine this. It's New Year's Eve, 1999. Most of the world is celebrating fireworks, champagne, the promise of a new millennium. But in Moscow, something extraordinary and deeply unsettling is happening behind closed doors. Russia's president walks up to a microphone and instead of wishing his country a happy new year,
Ухожу в отставку.
He resigns. And in his place, he hands the most powerful seat in the largest country on earth to a man almost nobody has ever heard of. A man who, just 10 years earlier, was burning secret documents in a cold German city, watching an empire collapse around him. His name was Vladimir Putin. And what happened next would change the entire world. To understand Putin, truly understand him, you can't just look at what he does today. You have to go back to the beginning, back to a cramped apartment in Leningrad, back to a boy who grew up fighting for survival, back to a KGB officer who watched the Soviet Union fall apart and made a silent, iron promise to himself. Because the man running Russia today is not just a politician. He is the product of decades of humiliation, ambition, and ice-cold calculation. Vladimir Putin was born on October 7th, 1952, in Leningrad, the city we now call St. Petersburg. But the Leningrad he was born into was not a place of grandeur. It was a city still bleeding from World War II. The Nazi siege of Leningrad had lasted 872 days. Over 1 million people died from bombs, from starvation, from the cold. Putin's own family didn't escape that horror. His 2 older brothers both died before he was born. His mother nearly starved to death. His father came home from the front with shrapnel in his leg. The family lived in a single room in a communal apartment. This was Putin's world. And yet, from the very beginning, there was something different about this boy. At 12 years old, he walked into a Sambo and judo gym and never looked back. Martial arts became his obsession, not just physically, but philosophically. The idea that a smaller, weaker opponent could use discipline and strategy to defeat someone much stronger. That idea never left him. But here's what really set the young Putin apart from the other kids in his neighborhood. He didn't just want to survive, he wanted to serve. Specifically, he wanted to be a spy. When Putin was still a teenager, he actually walked into the local KGB recruitment office and asked how he could join. Most teenagers dream about things like that. They don't actually do it. The officer at the desk told him to go home, study law, and come back when he graduated. So that's exactly what Putin did. He studied law at Leningrad State University, graduated, and applied to the KGB. They accepted him. Now, the KGB in the 1970s and 80s was not just an intelligence agency. It was the spine of Soviet power. It was everywhere. It controlled information, crushed dissent, monitored citizens, and projected Soviet strength around the world. Joining it wasn't just a career move. It was a statement of identity. For Putin, he trained for years. He learned surveillance, interrogation psychology, how to recruit foreign informants, how to operate in the shadows without leaving a trace. And in 1985, he received his most important assignment. Dresden, East Germany. Now, this is not what you might imagine for a spy thriller. Dresden was not Berlin. It wasn't the glamorous front line of Cold War espionage. It was a mid-tier city, and Putin's work there was largely administrative, recruiting contacts, collecting intelligence, managing informants. But what Dresden gave Putin was something far more valuable than any mission. It gave him a front row seat to the death of the Soviet Union. Because in November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Putin watched from Dresden as crowds flooded the streets, as East Germans tore down the symbols of Soviet control, as the empire he had devoted his entire adult life to simply collapsed. And in those terrifying hours, an angry mob surrounded the local KGB building where Putin worked. He called Moscow for instructions, for backup, for anything. Moscow said nothing. The line was silent, and so Putin did the only thing he could. He went outside, faced the crowd alone, and told them the building was armed and defended. He bluffed them back. Then he went inside and spent the night feeding documents into a furnace, burning everything before it could fall into the wrong hands. That silence from Moscow, that moment of total abandonment by the state he had served without question, that silence broke something in Vladimir Putin and built something else entirely. Putin returned to Russia in 1990, and the country he came back to was almost unrecognizable. The Soviet Union was in freefall. The economy was imploding, the ruble was worthless. Factories were shutting down, crime exploded, life expectancy collapsed. People who had savings watched them vanish overnight. For a man who had spent his career believing in the strength and permanence of the Soviet state, this was devastating. He briefly considered driving a taxi to make ends meet. Instead, he found a different door. Back in Leningrad, a charismatic professor named Anatoly Sobchak was running for city mayor on a platform of reform. Putin had actually studied under Sobchak at university. He reached out. Sobchak, recognizing Putin's KGB background and absolute loyalty, brought him on as an aide. And here, in the chaos of post-Soviet politics, Putin discovered his true talent. Not charisma, not speech-making. Loyalty, discretion, and the ability to handle the things that powerful men didn't want to touch directly. He became Sobchak's fixer, his enforcer, the person who dealt with the shadows, the corrupt bureaucrats, the organized crime figures, the gray market deals that kept a broken city from completely falling apart. Some of what Putin did during this period is still murky. There are allegations investigated but never fully proven about certain trade deals and food imports that went wrong. But what's undeniable is this. In a city drowning in chaos, Putin proved he could keep things running. And powerful people noticed. When Sobchak lost his re-election bid in 1996, Putin could have disappeared. Most people in his position would have. Instead, he packed his bags and moved to Moscow. And this is where the story gets fascinating. In Moscow, Putin was nothing. He had no political base, no public profile, no billionaire friends. He was just another mid-level bureaucrat with a KGB background in a city full of them. But he had something more valuable. He had a reputation for being completely, utterly reliable in the wild. Unpredictable chaos of Yeltsin-era Russia, where officials stole openly, where deals collapsed overnight, where loyalty was something you bought by the week. A man who simply did what he said he would do was extraordinary. He worked his way through the Kremlin. Administration quietly, efficiently, without drawing unnecessary attention. By 1998, Boris Yeltsin, by now elderly, increasingly unwell, and surrounded by people desperate to protect their own interests, appointed Putin as head of the FSB, the direct successor to the KGB. Putin was back in his world. In August 1999, Yeltsin did something shocking. He appointed the little-known Vladimir Putin as Prime Minister of Russia. Most political analysts laughed. They called Putin a placeholder, a nobody, a man who would be gone in 6 months. They were catastrophically wrong. Within weeks of taking office, apartment buildings in Moscow and other Russian cities were bombed. Nearly 300 civilians were killed. The bombings were blamed on Chechen terrorists. Russia was gripped by fear and fury. And Putin, this quiet, gray, almost invisible man, stepped to the podium and said something that Russians had been desperately waiting to hear. He was going to destroy the people responsible. Not negotiate. Not discuss. Destroy. He launched the Second Chechen War with overwhelming force. Ground forces pushed in. The campaign was brutal and, by Western standards, deeply controversial. But inside Russia, Putin's approval ratings went from roughly 2% to over 50% in a matter of months. People often ask how an unknown bureaucrat becomes the most powerful man in the world's largest country. In under a year, this is how. In a nation exhausted by humiliation, by weakness, by the chaos of the 90s, Putin offered something intoxicating, the feeling that Russia was strong again. On New Year's Eve, 1999, Yeltsin went on television. He looked old and tired. He apologized to the Russian people for the hardships of his era, and then he handed power, temporarily pending an election, to Vladimir Putin. Putin won that election in March 2000. He was 47 years old. Winning the presidency was just the beginning, because Russia in 2000 wasn't fully under anyone's control. A small group of extraordinarily wealthy men, the oligarchs, had essentially purchased the Russian economy during the chaos of the 90s. They owned the banks, the oil companies, the TV stations. They thought they could manage Putin the same way they managed everyone else. They were wrong. Putin moved against them with surgical precision. He didn't attack all of them at once. He made examples. Oligarchs who stayed out of politics and paid their taxes, they could keep their wealth. Oligarchs who challenged him, who funded opposition parties, who used their media empires to criticize the Kremlin, they were investigated, prosecuted, exiled, or imprisoned. The most famous case was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once the richest man in Russia. He funded opposition politicians. He was arrested in 2003, tried and spent a decade in prison. The message was received instantly. At the same time, something remarkable happened to the Russian economy. Oil prices soared globally, revenues flooded into government coffers. Putin used this window to stabilize the ruble, pay down foreign debt, raise wages, and lift millions of Russians out of poverty. For ordinary Russians in the early 2000s, life was genuinely getting better, and they credited one man. By the mid-2000s, Russia had rejoined the G8. Foreign investors were cautiously optimistic. Putin was giving speeches in fluent German to the German parliament. On the surface, it looked like Russia might be integrating with the Western world. But underneath, something very different was being built. He wasn't just building a state. He was building an empire. To understand what Putin wants, you have to understand how he sees history. He has said repeatedly and publicly that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Think about what that tells you about how this man sees the world. Putin does not see the borders drawn after 1991 as permanent or legitimate. He sees them as temporary wounds, lines drawn by weakness, and he has spent his entire presidency working slowly, patiently, to reverse them. Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, Ukraine again in 2022, each move following the logical. These are not foreign countries. These are Russian lands. Russian people, and no Western alliance, no matter how loud, will be allowed to pull them permanently out of Russia's orbit. His role models tell you everything. He has spoken admiringly of Peter the Great, the Tsar who modernized Russia through sheer force of will and expanded its empire westward. He has spoken of Stalin, not with horror, but with a kind of complicated respect. A man who, whatever his crimes, made Russia feared and powerful. Putin does not want to be remembered as the man who administered Russia. He wants to be remembered as the man who restored it. And that is precisely what makes him so dangerous and so difficult to deal with. The man-burning document in Dresden in 1989 made a promise to himself that night, and he has spent the last 25 years keeping it. Vladimir Putin is not a mystery if you know where to look. He is the product of poverty and pride, of a superpower's collapse and one man's refusal to accept it. He rose because Russia was broken and needed someone who projected strength. He stayed because he built systems that made leaving impossible for him and for everyone around him, whether you see him as a defender of Russian greatness or as a dangerous authoritarian reshaping the world through force. You cannot understand the 21st century without understanding him.